It all began with a single knock, one that shattered the silence and sent my heart racing. I opened the door, and there he stood, my boss, eyes holding secrets I couldn't yet understand. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. In that moment, everything felt wrong, yet irresistibly right. It all started with a knock on my door late at night, one that shattered the delicate balance I thought I had maintained in my life. What happens when you're pulled into a world of forbidden choices and secrets too heavy to keep? That knock didn't just open a door, unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. Stay with me as I share the story of how one moment changed everything. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating, thought-provoking stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. When the knock came at my door, I nearly dropped my wine glass. It was late, far too late for an unannounced visitor, and the sound reverberated through my tiny apartment like a warning. Setting the glass on the coffee table, I hesitated, my heart thumping in my chest. Through the peephole, I saw him, Mr. Andrews, my boss. My heart lurched, caught somewhere between surprise and dread. Why was he here? Opening the door, I forced a smile, but the shock in my voice betrayed me. "Mr. Andrews? Is everything okay?" He stood there in his usual tailored suit, though the jacket was slung over his shoulder and his tie hung loose, giving him an air of casual elegance that felt oddly out of place on my doorstep. His dark eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I felt exposed, like he could see right through me. "Sorry to show up unannounced," he said, his voice steady and deep, the kind of voice that demanded attention even in the silence of the night. "I didn't mean to intrude, but I thought it'd be easier to go over the final details for tomorrow's presentation without the distractions of the office." I hesitated, gripping the edge of the door. His sudden appearance felt odd, unsettling even, but I nodded, stepping aside. "Of course, come in." As he entered, the small space seemed to shrink, his presence filling every corner. He looked around briefly, taking in the mismatched furniture and scattered books, before his gaze settled back on me. "I hope this isn't too much of an inconvenience," he added, offering a polite smile. "Not at all," I lied, though my pulse quickened. "Can I get you something to drink? Water? Coffee?" He declined with a slight shake of his head, setting his jacket over the back of a chair. "This won't take long, I promise." I sat across from him at the small dining table, trying to focus on the papers he spread out in front of us. He spoke about strategies, slides, and timing, but I couldn't ignore the way his voice softened when he said my name, or the way his hand lingered on the edge of the table, inches from mine. The air was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that I didn't know how to address. I caught myself watching him more than I should have, the way his jaw tensed as he spoke, the subtle smile that played on his lips when he looked up at me. It was wrong. This was my boss, married, off limits in every possible way. And yet, sitting there with him in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. When he finally gathered his things to leave, his hand brushed mine as he reached for his jacket. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, his eyes lingering on mine. "I'll see you tomorrow." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak, and watched him walk out the door, leaving behind a silence that was louder than the knock that had started it all. After he left, I sat in silence, replaying every detail of our interaction. My mind raced, analyzing his words, his tone, the way his hand brushed against mine. Was it just my imagination, or had there been something unspoken between us? The truth was, I'd noticed him noticing me for months. Mr. Andrews wasn't the type of man who needed to explain himself. His authority was effortless. Tall, impeccably dressed, and always confident, He had a presence that made people lean in just to catch his words. He wasn't loud or boastful, he didn't need to be. His quiet command of a room was more powerful than any raised voice. I'd started at the company 2 years ago, fresh out of college and eager to prove myself. From the beginning, he'd been encouraging, praising my work in meetings and singling me out for recognition. At first, I chalked it up to him being a supportive boss. He valued good work, it wasn't personal. But then there were the moments, the times when I caught him watching me from across the office, his expression unreadable, but his focus unmistakable. The way he'd linger by my desk after hours, his tie loosened, and his demeanor softer than during the day. "You really outdid yourself on that proposal," he said one evening, leaning casually against the edge of my desk as I packed up my things. "Thank you," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've got a knack for this, you know," he continued, his eyes meeting mine. "It's rare to find someone so dedicated." It was a simple compliment, but the way he said it, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, made my heart race. At first I brushed off these moments as harmless. After all, he was married. I'd seen the photos on his desk, his wife, stunning in every way, her perfect smile framed by auburn curls. She seemed like the kind of woman who could do no wrong, the kind of woman who had it all. But he rarely talked about her. When he did, it was brief and almost dismissive. "She's been busy with her charity work," he mentioned once when someone asked about her. Another time, he joked about her tendency to redecorate their home every 6 months, as if it was more exhausting than endearing. Still, I reminded myself that they were married. Whatever I thought I saw in his lingering looks or subtle touches, I couldn't let myself believe it was real. And yet, the whispers around the office told a different story. "You know he's got a soft spot for her," one of my coworkers whispered during a lunch break, glancing at me before looking away quickly. I laughed it off, though my cheeks burned. "Don't be ridiculous, he's just being nice." Another coworker chimed in. "Nice, come on, we've all seen the way he looks at you. It's like you're the only person in the room." I hated the way their words made me feel, both guilty and exhilarated. I told myself it was just gossip, but deep down, I knew there was a grain of truth in it. One evening, after everyone else had left the office, he found me still working at my desk. I hadn't even noticed him approach until his voice broke the silence. "Burning the midnight oil again." Startled, I looked up to see him standing there, his tie undone, his sleeves rolled up. He looked more relaxed, more human than usual. "Just trying to get everything perfect for tomorrow," I replied, forcing a smile. "You're too hard on yourself," he said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from me. "You've already done more than enough." For a moment we just sat there in silence, the hum of the office lights filling the space between us. Then he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Do you ever feel like you're chasing something you'll never catch?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Like no matter how much you accomplish, there's always something missing, something just out of reach." I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't the kind of thing you expected your boss to say, and it wasn't the kind of conversation I was prepared to have. "Ooh, I guess everyone feels that way sometimes," I said finally, unsure if it was the right answer. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "You're probably right. But some people have a way of making you forget that feeling, even if just for a little while." My breath caught in my throat. Was he talking about me? Before I could say anything, he stood up, straightening his tie. "Don't stay too late," he said, his usual authoritative tone returning. "You've done enough for today." As he walked away, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. The moments like this were rare, but they were enough to keep me awake at night, replaying every word, every glance, every subtle shift in the air between us. I knew it was dangerous to read too much into it, but I couldn't help myself. Now, sitting alone in my apartment after his unexpected visit, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. My life was about to change. The following day at work, I tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to the previous night. I replayed the way his hand brushed mine, the intensity in his eyes as he said goodbye. Was I overanalyzing? Or was there something unspoken between us? As if reading my thoughts, he walked into the office, his usual confident stride making my pulse quicken. He greeted everyone with his usual charm, but when his gaze landed on me, it lingered for just a fraction longer than necessary. "Good morning," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes saying more. "Good morning," I replied, keeping my voice steady. The day dragged on, every glance and exchange between us charged with tension. By the time the clock hit 5 p.m., I was ready to escape, to clear my head and convince myself that I was imagining things. But as I was gathering my things, his voice stopped me. "Can I see you in my office for a moment?" I nodded, my heart pounding as I followed him inside. The door clicked shut behind me, and he motioned for me to sit. "I wanted to thank you for all the hard work you've been putting in," he began, his tone professional. But then his voice softened. "And for last night, I know it was late, and I appreciate you making time." "It wasn't a problem," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment. "I've been thinking about how much I rely on you. You've become indispensable to me, both professionally and My breath caught. There it was. Confirmation that this wasn't just in my head. He continued, I was wondering if you'd be willing to stop at my place again this evening. There's a project I'd like to discuss in more detail, and it's easier without the distractions of the office." I hesitated, the implications of his invitation hanging heavy in the air. "Is this about the quarterly report?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation grounded in work. "In part," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "But it's also about strategy moving forward. And honestly, I could use your input on something personal." The room felt stifling, the unspoken meaning of his words pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to decline, to draw a line in the sand and protect both of us from crossing it. But another part, a reckless, curious part, couldn't resist the pull of his attention. "Okay," I said finally, "I'll stop by." That evening, as I approached his home, nerves churned in my stomach. His house was grand but understated, nestled in a quiet neighborhood with manicured lawns and tall hedges. It looked like the kind of place where everything was perfect, where nothing ever went wrong. I rang the doorbell, my hands trembling slightly. The door opened almost immediately, and there he was, dressed casually in a button-down shirt and dark jeans, a far cry from his usual polished suit. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The atmosphere inside was warm and inviting, but there was something undeniably intimate about it. Soft jazz played in the background, and the faint aroma of cedarwood filled the air. A bottle of wine sat on the kitchen counter, alongside 2 glasses. "Nice place," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Thanks," he replied, gesturing toward the living room. "Make yourself comfortable." I sat on the plush couch, feeling out of place in such an elegant setting. He joined me, sitting closer than I expected. "So, what's the big project?" I asked, desperate to keep the conversation on safe ground. He smiled, but there was a hint of mischief in his eyes. "We'll get to that. But first, I want to talk about you." "Yes," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You're one of the most dedicated, talented people I've ever worked with. But I can't help feeling like there's more to you than what you show in the office." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to deflect with a laugh. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I see how hard you work, how much you care, but I also see the way you hold back. You don't have to, not with me. My heart raced as his words hung in the air. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Relax, he said, his tone soft. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I just want to understand you better. I appreciate that, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for the bottle of wine, pouring 2 glasses. To new beginnings, he said, holding his glass up. To new beginnings, I echoed, clinking my glass against his. As we sipped the wine, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, travel, hobbies, dreams. But the underlying tension never disappeared. His eyes never left mine for long, and his proximity felt both thrilling and dangerous. At one point, he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers brushing against my skin. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. You're incredible, you know that? He said, his voice low. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to run, to escape the intensity of the moment, but another part, a part I barely recognized, wanted to stay, to see where this would lead. When he leaned in closer, his intentions were clear. You can tell me to stop, he said softly. But if you don't, I hesitated, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. This was wrong. He was married. He was my boss. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. I didn't tell him to stop. His kiss was soft, almost tentative, as if waiting for me to pull away. I didn't. Instead, I let the moment consume me, the warmth of his lips erasing every doubt that had been racing through my mind. When we finally pulled apart, his gaze held mine, searching for any sign of hesitation. Are you okay? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though my heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Yes. He leaned back slightly, giving me space but keeping his hand on mine. I didn't mean to. I didn't plan this, he said, his words stumbling in a way I'd never heard before. Mr. Andrews was always composed, always in control. Seeing him like this, uncertain and vulnerable, only made him feel more real. It's okay, I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. Was it okay? He stood, running a hand through his hair. I don't want you to think I've done this before, because I haven't. This is new for me. I believed him. There was a rawness in his voice, a sincerity that made it impossible to doubt him. But it didn't make the situation any less complicated. We spent the next hour sitting on his couch, sipping wine and talking about everything and nothing. The intensity of the kiss hung between us, unspoken but ever present. He asked me about my childhood, my dreams, my fears. It was the kind of conversation that felt too intimate, too personal for 2 people who were supposed to be nothing more than colleagues. At one point, he reached out, brushing his fingers against mine. I can't remember the last time I talked to someone like this, he admitted. Not even with my wife. I stiffened at the mention of her. It was the first time he'd brought her up since I arrived, and it was a stark reminder of the line we were crossing. I don't know much about her, I said cautiously. He sighed, leaning back against the couch. Emma and I. We've grown apart. I don't think either of us meant for it to happen, but it did. We live in the same house, but it's like we're strangers. Sometimes I wonder if we ever really knew each other at all. His confession hung heavy in the air. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. He looked at me then, his expression serious. I know this isn't fair to you. I don't want to drag you into my mess, but there's something about you. I can't ignore it. The hours slipped by, and before I knew it, it was past midnight. I glanced at the clock, guilt settling in my stomach. I should go, I said, setting my wineglass down. He stood as I did, his hand brushing against mine. I'll walk you out. At the door we lingered, neither of us wanting to be the first to end the night. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and uncertainty. Thank you for coming, he said softly. I know this wasn't easy. It wasn't, I admitted. His hand lifted, hesitated, then cupped my cheek. "You're special, you know that?" I smiled faintly. "You've had too much wine." He laughed, but the sound was tinged with sadness. "Maybe, but it doesn't make it any less true." As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me like a wake-up call. I turned back to see him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Good night," I said, my voice barely audible. "Good night," he replied, watching as I walked away. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest. What had I done? What was I doing? At work, the dynamic between us had shifted. He was professional, composed, and as charming as ever. But when our eyes met across the room, there was a spark, a silent acknowledgement of what had happened. During a meeting, I felt his gaze on me, and when I glanced up, he smiled. Just the faintest curve of his lips. It sent a jolt through me, a reminder of the night before. Later that day, I found a note on my desk, written in his neat handwriting. "Can we talk? My office at 6 p.m. I folded the note quickly, glancing around to make sure no one had seen it. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my nerves growing with each passing hour. At 6 p.m., I knocked on his office door, my heart pounding. "Come in," he called. I stepped inside, and he closed the door behind me. The office was quiet, the blinds drawn, the faint hum of the city below the only sound. "Thanks for coming," he said, motioning for me to sit. I sat on the edge of the chair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "What did you want to talk about?" He leaned against his desk, his arms crossed. "About last night. I don't want you to think I regret it, because I don't. But I know it complicates things, and I need to know where you stand." I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out." He nodded, his expression serious. "That's fair. I don't want to rush you or pressure you into anything. I needed you to know how I feel." "How do you feel?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I feel like you've become the most important person in my life, and that terrifies me." His words left me speechless. I didn't know how to respond, so I said the only thing I could. "This can't be easy for you." "It's not," he admitted, "but nothing worth having ever is." The conversation ended with no clear resolution, just more questions and an unspoken understanding that things between us had changed irrevocably. That night, as I lay in bed, his words echoed in my mind. "You've become the most important person in my life." I didn't know what was ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The days following our conversation blurred into a haze of stolen glances and unspoken words. At work, Mr. Andrews, James, as I had started to think of him privately, maintained his professional demeanor. To everyone else, he was the same calm, collected leader they had always known. But for me, every interaction carried a weight that no one else could see. We avoided being alone, though not deliberately. The office had its rhythms, and staying within them felt like the only way to maintain a fragile sense of normalcy. But every look, every passing moment near him, ignited something in me that was impossible to ignore. Then, on a Friday afternoon, he called me into his office. The rest of the team was preparing to leave for the weekend, their energy light and carefree. My stomach twisted as I walked to his door, uncertain of what awaited. "Come in," he said when I knocked. I stepped inside, and he closed the door behind me, the sound clicking louder than usual in the quiet office. "I wanted to check in," he said, his tone casual, though his eyes betrayed a deeper intent. "I know things have been complicated. I want to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. He studied me for a moment, then sighed. "I don't want this to feel like something you're forced into. If you want to take a step back, I interrupted, surprising even myself with the force of my words. He blinked, then took a step closer. You don't? No, I said, my voice quieter this time. I don't. The silence between us stretched, thick and charged. He took another step closer, and I felt the air grow heavier. Say something, I whispered, the tension too much to bear. I don't want to ruin you, he said, his voice raw, but I can't stop thinking about you. The words hung in the air, and before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us. My hands reached for him, and his arms wrapped around me in an instant. His kiss was urgent, filled with weeks of restraint finally breaking free. The world outside his office faded away as we gave in to the pull that had been growing between us. His hands traced a path along my arms, my back, as if memorizing every curve. He pulled me closer, his breath warm against my skin. Are you sure about this? He murmured, his lips brushing against my ear. Yes, I breathed, my resolve firm. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes searching mine for any hesitation. Finding none, he kissed me again, deeper this time, his hands cupping my face. The sound of footsteps in the hallway brought us back to reality. We broke apart, our breathing uneven, and he pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence. Later, he said softly, his voice filled with a promise that sent a shiver down my spine. That evening, as the rest of the office emptied out, I lingered at my desk, pretending to finish up some work. When the building grew quiet, I made my way to his office, my heart pounding with anticipation. He was waiting for me, the tension in the room palpable as soon as I stepped inside. Without a word, he crossed the space between us, his hands finding mine and pulling me close. The blinds were drawn, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across the room. He led me to the couch in the corner, and we sat facing each other, the air thick with unspoken words. I don't know where this is going, he admitted, his voice low, but I know I can't stop myself. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his. Neither. What happened next was inevitable. The dam we had carefully constructed over weeks of restraint finally gave way, and the flood of emotions, tension, and desire overtook us. The hours slipped by unnoticed, the world outside his office forgotten. When I finally glanced at the clock, it was well past. I should go, I said reluctantly, though the thought of leaving felt impossible. He nodded but didn't release my hand. I don't want this to end. It doesn't have to, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He kissed me again, softly this time, as if savoring every second. Let me call you a car, he said, his tone gentle. I shook my head. I can manage. He walked me to the door, his hand lingering on mine as we said our goodbyes. Be safe, he said, his eyes holding mine. You too. Over the next few days, our connection deepened. We texted late into the night, our messages a mix of playful banter and heartfelt confessions. At work, we maintained our professionalism, though every glance and subtle touch carried the weight of our secret. One evening, he invited me to dinner at a small, secluded restaurant. The atmosphere was intimate, the candlelight casting a warm glow across his face. This feels surreal, I admitted as we sipped wine. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. Surreal, but right. I nodded, though a flicker of doubt lingered in the back of my mind. What about your wife? I asked hesitantly. His expression darkened. Emma and I, we haven't been a real couple in years. We're together for appearances, nothing more. Does she? He must, he said, a hint of frustration in his voice. We've both been living separate lives for so long. This, he gestured between us, feels more real than anything I've had with her in years. I wanted to believe him, and in that moment, I did. As the weeks passed, our relationship grew bolder. We found ways to steal moments together, a lingering touch in the hallway, a shared look during a meeting, a quiet evening in his office after hours. But with every secret rendezvous, the stakes grew higher. The whispers in the office became louder, the stolen glances more noticeable. I couldn't ignore the gnawing guilt that crept in when I thought about Emma, or the fear of what would happen if we were caught. Still, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. He had become a part of me, and the thought of losing him felt unbearable. "I don't know how this ends," I confessed one night as we lay tangled together on his couch. He kissed my forehead, his arms tightening around me. "It doesn't have to end," he said. "Not if we don't want it to." But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The first cracks in our fragile world appeared when Emma returned from an unexpected trip early. She showed up at the office, her presence sending a ripple of unease through the team. When she stopped by my desk to introduce herself, her smile was polite but sharp, her eyes scanning me with a scrutiny that made my stomach churn. "James has mentioned you," she said, her tone friendly but laced with something else. "Only good things, I hope," I replied, forcing a smile. "Of course," she said, though her gaze lingered on me a moment too long. As she walked away, I felt the walls closing in. The illusion of safety we had created was beginning to crumble, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep it from falling apart entirely. Emma's unexpected visit rattled me more than I cared to admit. Her polite demeanor and carefully measured words replayed in my mind for hours after she left. Every glance she cast my way felt like an unspoken accusation. Even at work, James seemed unfazed. If anything, he acted more composed, his charm and confidence unwavering. But when our eyes met across the room, the tension between us was undeniable. Later that day, he called me into his office under the guise of discussing a project. I hesitated at the door before knocking, my heart racing. "Come in," he said, his voice calm. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. He stood by the window, looking out at the city below. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and I wondered if he'd even noticed me enter. Finally, he turned, his expression unreadable. "She came by, didn't she?" I nodded. "She introduced herself. She seemed nice." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emma's always been good at appearances. She's mastered the art of saying 1,000 things without actually saying anything at all." I sat down, unsure of where this conversation was going. "Do you think she's suspect?" He walked over, leaning against his desk. "She knows something is different. She might not have the full picture yet, but Emma isn't blind. She's observant." His words sent a chill down my spine. The thought of her uncovering the truth, of everything being exposed, felt like a ticking time bomb. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. He reached out, taking my hand in his. "We stay careful. Nothing changes unless we decide it does." His touch was meant to reassure me, but it didn't ease the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. Over the next few weeks, the walls seemed to close in around us. Emma's visits to the office became more frequent, each one an unspoken reminder of the precarious position we were in. She was polite, even friendly, but there was a sharpness in her gaze that kept me on edge. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I found her waiting by the elevators. "Heading out?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes piercing. "Yes, just finished up for the day," I replied, forcing a smile. She stepped into the elevator with me, and the doors closed. For a moment, we stood in silence, the tension palpable. Then, without warning, she spoke. "You're close to James, aren't you?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "He's my boss. We work together closely on a lot of projects." She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "James has always had a way of drawing people in. It's one of the things that made me fall for him. He makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed silent, my pulse pounding in my ears. As the elevator reached the ground floor, she turned to me with a small smile. "Have a good evening." "You too," I manage, my voice barely steady. As I walked to my car, her words echoed in my mind. Did she know? Was this her way of warning me, or was I reading too much into it? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction with Emma. The guilt I'd been suppressing for weeks threatened to consume me, but so did the thought of losing James. The next day, he pulled me aside during a break, his expression serious. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low. "I'm just overwhelmed," I admitted. He stepped closer, his concern evident. "If this is too much—" "It's not that," I interrupted. "It's just Emma. She's watching me, watching us." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. She's been more persistent lately. But I promise you, she doesn't know anything." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've been through this before," he said quietly. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Before?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Emma and we've had issues for years. This isn't the first time things have gotten complicated." I stared at him, struggling to process what he was saying. "So I'm not the first?" "No," he admitted, "but this is different. You're different." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but it didn't erase the sting of his confession. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Because I didn't want you to think this was just another fling. It's not. What I feel for you is real." I wanted to believe him, but the doubt in my heart was too loud to ignore. The final straw came a week later. Emma arrived at the office unannounced, her presence sending a wave of unease through the team. She requested to see James, and they disappeared into his office, the door closed tightly behind them. An hour later, I was called into the conference room for a meeting. Emma was there, sitting at the head of the table alongside James. "Thank you all for joining us on such short notice," Emma began, her tone sharp but professional. "I wanted to address some concerns that have been brought to my attention." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on me. "There have been rumors circulating about inappropriate relationships within the office," she continued, her voice cold. "I want to make it clear that this company has a zero-tolerance policy for such behavior." My stomach dropped. Though she didn't name names, her meaning was clear. After the meeting, I found James in his office, his face a mask of tension. "She knows," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression grim. "She doesn't have proof, but she's not going to let this go." "What do we do?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We lay low. Be careful, this will blow over." But I wasn't so sure. The weight of the situation pressed down on me, and for the first time I questioned whether this was worth it. That night I received a text from James. "I need to see you, my place, 9 p.m. Against my better judgment, I went. When I arrived, he was waiting for me, his expression torn between anger and desperation. "Emma's making this impossible," he said, pacing the room. "She's trying to control everything, to back me into a corner." "Maybe she has a right to," I said softly. He stopped, staring at me. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe we've gone too far," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe this isn't sustainable." His expression darkened. "So that's it? You're giving up?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't keep living like this." He stepped closer, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't want to lose you." Tears filled my eyes as I looked at him. I don't lose you either. But I don't know how to keep you without losing myself." The following morning, the tension at work was unbearable. Emma's presence lingered in the office even though she wasn't physically there. Her pointed comments from the meeting replayed in my mind, and every glance from a coworker felt like silent judgment. James and I barely spoke throughout the day. When we did, it was strained, our usual connection buried under the weight of our shared guilt and fear. It was as though the walls were closing in and there was no escape. By mid-afternoon, I noticed an unusual buzz in the office. People whispered in hushed tones, glancing at James's closed office door. My stomach twisted. Something was wrong. "Did you hear?" a coworker murmured to another as they passed by my desk. "Oh, what?" Emma filed a formal complaint. "It's about him and someone in the office." My heart dropped. I knew I should have stayed out of it, but curiosity and panic got the better of me. "What's going on?" I asked one of the interns who had overheard the exchange. He hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I'm not supposed to say anything, but Emma's accusing Mr. Andrews of having an affair with someone here. Apparently, she's demanding HR launch an investigation." The room spun. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was real. Emma was making her move, and James and I were directly in the crosshairs. By the time the day ended, I was exhausted, both mentally and emotionally. I left the office quickly, avoiding any prolonged conversations with my coworkers. As I stepped outside, my phone buzzed. It was a text from James. "We need to talk. My place, now." The words sent a chill through me, but I couldn't ignore them. I drove to his house, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When I arrived, he was waiting at the door, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. He pulled me inside quickly, closing the door behind us. "Emma's gone too far," he said, pacing the living room. "What did she do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He filed an official complaint," he said, his voice tense. "She's claiming I've been involved with an employee. She doesn't have proof, but she's using it to pressure the board into forcing me out." I sat down, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "What happens now?" He stopped pacing, turning to face me. "They'll investigate, they'll question everyone, and if they find anything..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. "What about us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His expression softened as he sat beside me. "I don't regret anything with you, but I won't let her destroy your career because of me. If it comes to that, I'll take the blame. I'll make sure you're protected." His words were meant to comfort me, but they only heightened my anxiety. "And what about you?" He shrugged, a bitter smile on his lips. "Emma's been angling to ruin me for years. This is just another weapon in her arsenal." I reached out, placing my hand on his. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," he said, squeezing my hand. "No matter what happens, I'm not letting you go." The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. HR interviews began almost immediately, with employees being called in one by one. The questions were vague but pointed. "Have you noticed anything unusual about Mr. Andrews's behavior? Has he ever shown favoritism toward anyone in the office? Have you witnessed any inappropriate conduct?" By the time they called me in, I was a wreck. I sat across from the HR representative, my hands folded tightly in my lap. "We're just conducting a routine inquiry," she said, her tone overly pleasant. "We're looking into some concerns about workplace conduct and relationships. You work closely with Mr. Andrews, correct?" "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Would you describe your relationship as purely professional?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. My heart raced, but I forced myself to nod. "Yes, it's professional. He's my boss." She studied me for a moment before scribbling something on her notepad. "Have you ever felt uncomfortable or pressured in your interactions with him?" "No," I said quickly. "Never." The interview continued, each question a careful probe into my connection with James. By the time it ended, I felt drained, as though every ounce of energy had been sucked. That evening, James called me. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice tense. I asked a lot of questions, I said, about us. What did you say? I told them everything was professional, I replied. But James, what if they don't believe me? They'll believe you, he said firmly. Emma doesn't have any proof. She's bluffing. But even as he said the words, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The investigation dragged on for weeks, the tension in the office growing with each passing day. Emma's presence loomed over everything, even when she wasn't physically there. The whispers among coworkers grew louder, the stares more blatant. One afternoon, I found an envelope on my desk with no name or return address. Inside was a single photo. James and me, sitting together at the restaurant where we'd had dinner weeks earlier. My blood ran cold. I hurried to James's office, closing the door behind me. "We have a problem," I said, handing him the photo. He stared at it, his jaw tightening. "Where did you get this?" "It was on my desk," I said. "Someone knows." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "This is bad," he muttered. "What do we do?" He looked at me, his expression grim. "We wait, and we hope this doesn't go any further." But it did. The photo found its way to HR, and suddenly the investigation was no longer just about rumors. It was about evidence. James was called into a meeting with the board, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. That night, he called me from his car. "They've suspended me," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I'm so sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "It's not your fault," he said. "This was Emma's plan all along." "What happens now?" "I fight," he said, "for my career, for us, for everything." But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too far gone. The day after James told me he'd been suspended, the office was buzzing with rumors. Everyone had heard something, though the details varied. Some whispered about Emma's involvement, others speculated about James's alleged misconduct, and a few eyed me with this. I kept my head down, avoiding unnecessary conversations, but it didn't matter. The glances, the whispers, the knowing looks, they were everywhere, and I couldn't escape them. By mid-morning, HR called me into their office again. My stomach churned as I walked down the long hallway, each step heavier than the last. "Please have a seat," the HR representative said as I entered. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of discomfort. "We've received new information regarding the investigation," she began, her voice measured. "I'm sure you understand the importance of being truthful as we work through this." "I've been honest," I replied, my voice steady despite the anxiety clawing at my insides. She slid a photo across the table, the same one that had been left on my desk. "This was submitted anonymously," she said. "Can you explain it?" I stared at the photo, my heart pounding. The image of James and me at the restaurant, leaning toward each other, was damning. It didn't matter that nothing inappropriate had happened that night. The context was enough to fuel every rumor and suspicion. "We had dinner to discuss a project," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It was professional." Her expression remained unreadable. "The board has concerns about the nature of your relationship with Mr. Andrews. Are you certain there's nothing more to disclose?" I hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. "There's nothing to disclose," I said finally, forcing the words out. She studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you for your time." That evening I met James at his apartment. He looked tired, his usual confidence replaced by a weary determination. "They're going to fire me," he said, pouring himself a drink. "They can't do that," I protested. "Taken," he said bitterly. "Emma's given them just enough to justify it. The photo, the rumors, the complaints, it's all adding up." I sank onto the couch, the enormity of the situation crashing over me. I'm so sorry. He sat beside me, taking my hand in his. This isn't your fault. It's mine. I should have known Emma wouldn't let this go. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm meeting with the board tomorrow, he said. They'll want me to sign an agreement. Something to keep this quiet in exchange for a clean exit. No scandal, no headlines. And if you don't sign? He sighed. They'll make this public. It'll destroy my career and drag you into it. The next day, James faced the board. I waited anxiously at my desk, unable to focus on anything else. When he returned to the office later that afternoon, his expression was grim. It's done, he said as he passed my desk. I followed him to his office, closing the door behind us. What did they say? Emmy gave me an ultimatum, he said, leaning against his desk. Resign quietly or face termination with cause. I felt a surge of anger on his behalf. That's not fair. You didn't do anything wrong. He laughed bitterly. Didn't I? I crossed a line. I knew the risks, and I did it anyway. My heart ached at his words, the weight of our choices crushing us both. What are you going to do? I signed the papers, he said quietly. It's over. The days that followed were surreal. James packed up his office, his departure handled with the kind of careful discretion that the company excelled at. Officially, he was leaving to pursue new opportunities, but everyone knew the truth. His absence left a void in the office, one that no one dared to acknowledge. The whispers died down, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that lingered in every corner. For me, the fallout was far from over. Though I kept my job, the stigma of being the one clung to me like a shadow. My co-workers avoided me, their smiles forced, their conversations short. Emma, meanwhile, had won. She was the picture of composure, her victory quiet but undeniable. One evening, weeks after James's departure, I received a call from him. How are you holding up? He asked, his voice warm despite the distance between us. I'm surviving, I said honestly. What about you? I'm figuring things out, he said. It's strange not having the routine of work anymore. But maybe it's a good thing. A fresh start. I miss you, I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I miss you too, he said softly. But we both knew this wasn't going to be easy. Do you regret it? There was a pause on the other end of the line. No, he said finally. I regret how it ended, but I don't regret us. Tears filled my eyes as I listened to his words. What happens now? I don't know, he admitted, but I do know this. I don't want to lose you. Despite his promise, distance grew between us. The calls became less frequent, the messages shorter. Life moved on, pulling us in different directions. At work, I threw myself into projects, determined to prove that I could rise above the scandal. But the whispers never fully disappeared, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. One afternoon, Emma approached me in the break room. I heard James is doing well, she said casually, pouring herself a cup of coffee. That's good to hear, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. You know, you were just a piece in a much bigger game. I hope you realize that. Her words stung, but I refused to let her see it. I'm sure you're very pleased with how things turned out. She smiled, a cold, calculated expression. I always get what I want. Months later, I heard through mutual connections that James had moved to a new city and started a consulting business. It seemed he was rebuilding his life, piece by piece. As for me, I stayed at the company, though the experience left scars that never fully healed. I learned to navigate the quiet judgment of my peers, to carry the weight of my choices without letting it break. Every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about James, his laugh, his touch, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world. But those moments were fleeting, replaced by the harsh reality of what our relationship had cost us both. In the end, it wasn't love that destroyed us. It was the lies, the secrets, and the choices we made in the shadows. And as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. Months passed, and though life seemed to return to some semblance of normal, I often found myself haunted by the memories of James. He'd been gone for a while now, and our contact had dwindled to nothing more than a few sparse text messages. I tried to move forward, but the lingering whispers in the office and the shadow of my choices made it impossible to forget. One quiet Friday evening, as I was packing up my things to leave work, I noticed an envelope on my desk. It was unmarked, just like the one that had contained the damning photograph months earlier. My chest tightened as I picked it up, my hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly. Written in bold, deliberate handwriting were the words, "I know everything." I froze, the words swimming before my eyes. Who had sent this? Emma? One of my coworkers? Someone else entirely? The note didn't include any threats or demands, but the weight of its implications was clear. Whoever had written it wasn't done with me yet. The following Monday, the tension in the office was suffocating. Though no one said anything outright, I felt the stares more keenly than ever. It was as if they all knew about the note, though I couldn't be sure if it was paranoia or reality. By lunchtime, my nerves were frayed. I stepped outside for air, hoping the crisp autumn breeze would help clear my head. As I walked, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Hello." A familiar voice came through the line, sending a jolt of surprise through me. "It's James." "James?" I asked, my voice tinged with both relief and confusion. "Why are you calling from this number?" "I had to change my phone," he said, his tone cautious. "Things have been complicated." "What's going on?" "I didn't want to tell you this over the phone, but I think Emma's still playing games," he said. "There's more to what happened than you realize." I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "And we meet? It's too much to explain here." I hesitated. It had been months since we'd seen each other, and the thought of facing him again stirred up emotions I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. But his urgency was impossible to ignore. "Okay," I said finally. "When and where?" That evening I met him at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. He looked different, more tired, more weathered. But the moment our eyes met, the connection between us reignited like a spark to dry. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice warm but tinged with unease. "What's going on, James?" I asked, sitting across from him. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "After I left, I started digging into Emma's actions. I knew she was manipulative, but I didn't realize how far she'd go to destroy me. And you. What did you find?" "Everything she did was calculated," he said. "The anonymous photos, the complaints to HR, even the rumors. She orchestrated all of it. But it wasn't just about me. She wanted to ruin you too." My stomach churned. Why would she do that? I was nothing to her. "Because she couldn't stand the idea of me caring about someone else," he said bitterly. "She always wanted control, and the moment she realized I was pulling away, she decided to take everything from me, and you were collateral damage." His words hit me like a freight train. The months of tension, the whispers, the isolation. It had all been part of her plan. "But why tell me this now?" I asked. "What can we do about it?" He hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "Because I think she's not done. Look at this." He showed me a series of messages, screenshots from an email account linked to Emma. The emails detailed her plans to send the photograph to industry contacts, ensuring neither James nor I would find work in the same field again. "Safety wants to blacklist us," he said. to make sure we're not just ruined here, but everywhere. The enormity of it was staggering. I felt the walls closing in, the weight of her calculated cruelty suffocating me. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every shadow felt like a threat, every passing car like a tale. When I got home, I checked my mail, half expecting another anonymous note, but there was nothing, just the usual bills and junk mail. I poured myself a glass of wine, trying to calm my nerves, when my phone buzzed again. Another message from an unknown number. "You're not safe." Panic surged through me. I called James immediately. "It's escalating," I said, my voice trembling. "Are you at home?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Yes." "Stay there, lock the doors. I'll be there soon." James arrived within the hour, his face tense. He checked the locks on the doors and windows before sitting beside me on the couch. "We can't let her win," he said firmly. "How?" I asked, tears brimming in my eyes. "She has all the power. She's already ruined you, and now she's coming for me." "He's not invincible," he said. "I've been gathering evidence. Emails, bank statements, everything I can to prove what she's done. If we go public with this, we can expose her for who she really is." "Public?" I echoed, the word filling me with dread. "It's the only way," he said. "If we let her keep doing this in the shadows, she'll never stop. But if we shine a light on her, she won't have anywhere to hide." The thought of going public, of putting everything out there for the world to see, terrified me. But James was right. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about stopping Emma before she destroyed anyone else. In the weeks that followed, we worked together to build our case. It wasn't easy. The process dredged up painful memories and forced us to confront the full extent of the damage Emma had caused. But slowly, piece by piece, we uncovered the truth. The anonymous emails, the fake complaints, the carefully orchestrated smear campaign. It all pointed back to her. When we finally had enough evidence, we took it to a lawyer. "This is solid," the lawyer said, his tone confident. "If you're willing to take this to court, you have a strong case for defamation and malicious intent." It was a small glimmer of hope, but it was enough. The case made headlines, and Emma's carefully curated reputation began to crumble. The same media outlets she had tried to use against us turned their attention to her, exposing her schemes for the world to see. In the end, she settled out of court, agreeing to a public apology and financial restitution. It wasn't the closure I had imagined, but it was enough to reclaim some semblance of control over my life. As for James and me, the experience left scars that would take years to heal, but it also brought us closer in ways I hadn't thought possible. "We survived," he said one evening as we sat together, the weight of the past finally lifting. "Barely," I said with a small smile. "But we did," he said, taking my hand in his. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could begin again. Months after the court case and the media storm, life finally began to settle. The scars of what had happened were still there, but they were healing, slowly but surely. Emma's public downfall had been swift and brutal. She was forced to resign from her prestigious charity work and faced social ostracism among the same circles where she had once reigned supreme. For me, returning to the office felt like stepping into a battlefield long after the war was over. The whispers were gone, replaced by cautious smiles and nods from coworkers who seemed relieved to see that I hadn't crumbled under the weight of everything. Still, I decided it was time for a fresh start. I handed in my resignation a few weeks later. James, who had started his consulting business, encouraged me to join him. But I needed time to find my own path. "We need space to grow," I told him one evening over dinner. "Separately, for now." He nodded, though I could see the reluctance in his eyes. I understand, but don't forget, I'm here whenever you need me. The first few months on my own were difficult, but liberating. I took time to rediscover myself, exploring interests I had put on hold for years: photography, travel, writing. I allowed myself to embrace the things that made me feel alive. James and I kept in touch, though less frequently than before. The distance was painful, but it gave us both the clarity we needed. One evening, as I was sorting through old photos, my phone buzzed with a text from him. "Dinner this weekend? There's something I want to talk to you about." I hesitated before replying. It had been months since we'd seen each other, and I wasn't sure what to expect. But curiosity won out. When I arrived at the small, candlelit restaurant, he was already waiting. He stood as I approached, his smile warm and familiar. "You look amazing," he said, pulling out my chair. "Thank you," I replied, feeling a flutter of nerves I hadn't expected. The dinner was easy, the conversation flowing naturally. We talked about our new lives, the changes we'd gone through, and the lessons we'd learned. For the first time in a long while, there were no secrets, no hidden agendas, just honesty. As the evening wore on, James reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, his tone serious but gentle, "about us, about everything we've been through." I held my breath, waiting. "I don't regret any of it," he continued, "even the hard parts, the messy parts. It all led us here. And I'm not ready to let go of you." Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at him. "James, He held up a hand, stopping me. "I'm not asking for an answer right now. I just wanted you to know how I feel. You're important to me, more than I think I even realized." For the first time in months, I felt the weight of everything lift. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. "Let's take it slow," I said finally. "No expectations, no pressure. Let's just see where this goes." His smile was soft, his relief palpable. Slow sounds perfect. As we left the restaurant, the cool night air wrapped around us. He walked me to my car, his hand brushing mine. For the first time in a long while, I felt hope. A quiet, steady hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. And this time, it would be on our terms.